It's Tuesday, October 25th, 2016. This is 3000 NFL Mock Draft, the weekly NFL Draft podcast where myself, Kenneth Arthur, and Rob Staten of fieldgoals.com and SeahawksDraftBlog.com get together and talk about college football, the NFL Draft, and the Seattle Seahawks. And that's what we're going to do to top off this episode right now is talk about the Seattle Seahawks and their wild 6-6 tie against the Arizona Cardinals on Sunday Night Football. You've heard all of the interesting factoids about ties in the last few days, enough to make you sick of it. So we don't necessarily have to talk about the tie itself or what went into it or even necessarily the kicks to some degree. We can just talk about that incredible performance, I think, by both defenses to keep each other out of the end zone for 75 minutes apiece, and whether or not you want to talk about the 50-plus minutes that the Seahawks defense spent on the field or whatever it was, 90-plus plays, or you want to talk about the Arizona Cardinals, really having to that degree to be able to have a rested defense for that. I'll probably, basically playing a normal 4-quarter game of a defensive amount of snaps, but still doing an incredible job against Russell Wilson and Jimmy Graham and Doug Baldwin to keep them out of the end zone for that long. And I think that at the end of the day, Russell Wilson and Jimmy Graham especially were able to do just enough against that incredible secondary and absolutely, having very little time in the pocket against Calais Campbell and the rest of the Arizona Cardinals front seven, being able to get something together in crunch time. And the incredible performance by the Seahawks defense was really something to applaud, though. Rob, to some degree, are you a little bit concerned about the hard-fought effort that the Seahawks just put together moving forward? The fact that they're coming off of a Sunday night game, that was that tiring, that difficult, that really challenging for these guys, that now they have to go on the road again to New Orleans and face Drew Brees and the Saints, who have a trio of really talented receivers. Coby Fleener is a very athletic tight end that seems to be, on pace to put up 600 or 700 yards in his first season with the Saints. Going up against Drew Brees, are you concerned that the defense might have a lapse this weekend?
No, I'd be more concerned if they were playing a really physical defense that runs the ball particularly well as a feature, because then I think that you could tire them out if you were going to play that style. But that's not New Orleans. They're very much pass heavy, and I don't think that their offensive line will be able to handle the pass rush of Seattle. I think they'll still be able to make some plays. And I think that the fact that the defense for New Orleans has been so porous should help the Seahawks manage the game a little better. So they should be able to extend drives on offense, keep the defense off the field in a way that they couldn't against Arizona. And that should help as well. I mean, my takeaway from the Arizona game would be that we have just witnessed one of the great defensive performances. And I don't think it's been talked about enough. There's been a lot of focus on certain things that Bruce Arians said after the game, or the fact that the two kickers missed, kicks that I think I think if you gave me or you, Kenny, a chance to go and kick a field goal from 28 yards or whatever it was, I would back myself to do it. I think, the example I used to somebody the other day was that I think you could put your toe under the ball and maybe even flick it over the bar from that range. It's not a difficult situation. And the fact that they both missed was incredible. But, we watched 11 Warriors on defense for Seattle, plus the guys that were subbing in. And it was incredible. And being able to sort of sit here now a couple of days on and recall that game and not living in the moment, you appreciate how good it was. I mean, the play of the two linebackers, Wagner and Wright, was just incredible. Cliff Averill rushing the passer. The way that Deshaun Shed covered the Earl Thomas hits and the way that he got across to deny David Johnson, which for me is a really fantastic example of brilliant defensive play, that they stopped David Johnson getting in the end zone in overtime when he was a millimeter away from scoring a touchdown there. To keep the guys out from close in when they were trying to run it in. And I just find that, that was just an unbelievable display. And because the offense didn't help them and didn't have a drive of any note in the entire regulation, I think we have seen that as people kind of wring their hands a little bit about the offense and worry themselves and fret about the offensive line, I think what we've really genuinely seen is that this team is capable of winning a Super Bowl because of that defense, because it is that good. The Broncos won a Super Bowl last year basically without a passing offense because of the way Peyton Manning played. The Broncos had the 17th best rushing game in the regular season, so average, the definition of an average offense, really, running the ball and throwing. But they had an elite defense, and the way that this Seahawks defense is playing this year, it looks even better than the Broncos did last year. So I personally was very encouraged by that. I don't think a tie is a bad result for the Seahawks. I think they're well placed. So I think a couple of days on, I feel really positive about what we saw, and I think they deserve a real tip of the cap for that defense, because that was a legendary performance that night.
Yeah, you mentioned David Johnson's 1 inch short of the goal line non-touchdown that was stopped there by Earl Thomas. And we've seen Earl Thomas go from the struggles that it would seem to be from the film that we had seen, that maybe there was some struggles. And I think anytime any player, as great as they are, goes through some struggles, we do have to sort of question what's happening, because we're seeing right now with Aaron Rodgers, who should be in the prime of his career, 32, 33 years old, dating back to the beginning of last season, or maybe in the middle of the last season, is like 30th in yards per attempt and passer rating. And somehow, despite his numbers, Aaron Rodgers seems to still be getting the job done. And the Packers, though they do have a phenomenal run defense, don't think that they should be as good as they seem to be, or win as many games as they win, based on the play that they're getting statistically from Aaron Rodgers. But at the same time, something seems to be working. And when you watch the Packers games, you can see Aaron Rodgers have these throws or these plays that so clearly make him a Hall of Fame quarterback, but still is, there's that question of whether or not there's something wrong or not. So with Earl Thomas in those first few games, despite the fact that he's 27 and he's been to the last 5 Pro Bowls, you do start to wonder in these last 2 games, 3 games, especially this game, it's like, oh, wait, no. Yeah, I remember. He's one of the 5 or 10 best players in the entire league. It's ridiculous that in the NFL top 100 this year, he was 66th. Just as perspective, Blake Bortles was 56th. So, for Earl Thomas to be that low, now you watch him again and you're like, wait a minute, without this guy who just won the game, and then you realize, oh yeah, he did that exact same thing against the Rams. He is so fast and he's so quick and he hits so hard and he's so everywhere on the field, and the emotion that he brings to every play is also just so fun to watch as a Seahawks fan. That it was games like this one that you are reminded of how special of a player that you're watching, that you would think, when we're talking about Earl Thomas in 10 years, when the new era of fan comes along, whether or not it's our children or, Cardinals fans, that it's like you just want to just say, what was he like? What was Earl Thomas like? And it's like, this is the moment. Soak it in. What was your thoughts though on the performance of Kelsey McRae, because he's had to play the last 2 games in place of Cam Chancellor. He also had a game-saving tackle. The play before Earl Thomas's, he showed off that 4.5 speed to run down J.J. Nelson and stop the game. So the defense has still been perhaps the best in the NFL with Kelsey McRae and without Mike Morgan, and they really haven't paid any attention to that Sam linebacker spot. So it really seems like their answer for the loss of Bruce Irvin is, okay, we just won't use that position and we'll be fine and we'll do different things, and we don't need some great player at Sam. What were your thoughts on Kelsey McRae? Does he show you what you need to see for the Seattle Seahawks to move on without Cam Chancellor next season?
No, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the suggestion that the Seahawks are going to be without Cam Chancellor is I think it's too often discussed, and it's mainly inspired because of the holdout last year, and also the kind of feeling that he's breaking down. And he's had a few injuries, but I just think that Cam Chancellor is so important. I mean, he is basically the leader of the defense, and I think you have to persevere with that. And I don't think that Kelsey McRae has to replace Cam Chancellor. I think what we will see is we will see them manipulate the lack of Mike Morgan and players who can play in that kind of role with Kevin Pierre-Louis out as well. I think we will, if Cam Chancellor comes back this weekend, I think the feeling is that he will, then what we will see is a mixture of Cam sort of playing up and, almost as a linebacker a little bit more in that spot, with Kelsey McRae playing safety, or vice versa. Or we'll see Cassius Marsh playing in that role. So that Kelsey McRae will still get a fairly high amount of snaps. They will find a way to get him on the field as well as Cam Chancellor. And maybe it will be at the expense of a Frank Clark or a Cassius Marsh. It could be that Marsh, Clark, and McRae kind of rotate in depending on down and distance in certain situations. So it's a nice problem for the Seahawks to have. But I think that Cam Chancellor will very much be a part of this team. I think that Kelsey McRae played very well against Arizona. I would find it hard to criticize any of the defenders who played against Arizona. I just thought it was a superhuman effort from them. I mean, it's just the fact that they were on the field for so long. And when the offense has to go and punt the ball 9 times and give the ball straight back to Arizona, the Arizona offense was not doing that. People have talked about the Cardinals defense played well as well. That's very true. They limited the Seahawks. They played a good game, but to be on the field for, what was it, like 45 minutes in the end, to have to just somehow find that energy late in overtime to just keep them out of the end zone, when Bruce Arians, I mean, he ran the ball twice before the kick at the post. And he was saying, I know you're tired. We are going to run this in for a touchdown, that we have more chance running this in with David Johnson from 1 yard out and scoring and winning the game than our kicker has of kicking this goal. And I don't think that was a review of the kicker. I think that was a review of what he thought about the Seahawks defense in that situation. And the Seahawks defense just refused to be beaten that way. They basically said to Bruce Arians, you are not going to win the game by scoring a touchdown. You are going to have to get that kicker out here. You're going to have him kick from close range. You're going to have Bobby Wagner jumping over your center. You're going to have Richard Sherman rushing from the left-hand side. That is how you are going to win this game. We are not going to allow you to do it running up the gut from the 1 yard line. And I just thought that was, the fact that Carroll was so pumped up after the game, I understand why it was, because that was just, it was incredible to witness. And I just think that as the years go by, we will look back on that performance. We will look back on this result, because it is just a legendary display by I think I wrote after the game that it was an all-time great performance by an all-time great defense. And I think that's what we'll come to remember that game by.
Rob, I just feel a rant coming on. So, as you talked, suddenly it hit me, and I have one of these patented rants. By the way, we are 3000 NFL Mock Draft live. Just decided a couple minutes after the podcast started to try this one where we just throw it up live on the website. So if you have any comments about what we're saying or questions, we'll try and get to those at some point. But and then we'll get soon, and we're also going to get to this breaking news that the Seahawks have placed Quentin Jefferson on injured reserve and signed Malikia Goodson, and we'll talk about him here in a minute. But when you talk about the decisions of Bruce Arians and Pete Carroll and the game, it just reminded me of the times this week that I've heard that the Seahawks got away with one and that the Cardinals deserve to win the game. And it's like the Cardinals should have won. The Seahawks should have lost. The Cardinals got robbed. The Seahawks got away with one. And I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, what fucking game did you watch? And it's like, even if you didn't, there was nothing, to the point of like, okay, like the Green Bay game in 2012 or 2013. And I get it. Like, that was straight up a questionable call by the refs. And if I was on the other side, I'd be like, wow, well, that was it. You got stolen a win from us. And I totally get that. But both teams had 75 minutes to score a touchdown, and neither one did. The Seahawks defense, you say like, no, you got outplayed. Really? The Cardinals offense was out there for so long, and they had Carson Palmer, who was supposed to be, was second in MVP voting last year. And they've got Larry Fitzgerald, one of the greatest receivers of all time. And, they've got, other players, Michael Floyd is an extremely flawed receiver. But David Johnson, one of the top 5 running backs in the NFL. You've got all of that going up against the Seahawks defense for 50 plus minutes of actual field time and couldn't score a touchdown. Why don't we once go and look at a defense and say, instead of looking at what the fact that I mean, the Seahawks offense couldn't get going, and it was much more embarrassing. And it was, you could say 300 to 50 yards or whatever. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, yeah, that defense did such a damn good job that they were out there for so long that they just absolutely dominated the performance. Because if you're saying that the Seahawks offense didn't play well, then you're saying that the Arizona Cardinals defense wasn't that special. And if you're going to say that that the Cardinals defense, what's your excuse for the Cardinals offense to go out there and never put up any points? The Seahawks blocked a punt. The Seahawks blocked a kick. The Cardinals had a chance from, the 1 yard line to kick a field goal, and they got a delay of game penalty that sent them back 5 yards. And you would think to yourself, it doesn't matter about the delay game penalty, but when that ball hit the upright, if you're telling me that if he's 5 yards closer, if it doesn't go through the upright, I think that it does. It doesn't have as much, that's how close that it was, obviously. And so if the Cardinals couldn't get the job done, the Cardinals didn't deserve to win. The Cardinals didn't deserve to win the game. If you say neither team deserved to win, that's why it's a tie. No matter what goes into a game, no matter what you think a team should have or should not have won, guess what? The team that should have won, whatever it is. They went out there for 60 minutes, and I don't care if it was, the difference was a trick play. I don't care if the difference was, a player fumbling the ball after, his team had done so much to win a game. You were all in that position to do the game planning and the execution to win the game. The Arizona Cardinals were at home. They had every advantage to go out there and win a game against the Seahawks without Cam Chancellor and, without you went down to their third string linebacker and all of these things going against them. And the Cardinals, had to go without John Brown and this and that, but they did not deserve to win that game. They should have won that game. It was a tie, and that's what both teams got, exactly what they deserved. I don't want to hear any more outsiders that aren't even fans of the Seahawks or Cardinals saying that, Seattle stole another one or whatever. The Seahawks just played one of the best games I've ever seen of defense in my life. And the fact that they came out of there with a tie, I do feel good about it because it's not a loss. And I don't really think too much about the Stephen Hauschka missed kick anymore at all. At the time, I was like, that stinks. But, to be sitting here at 4-1-1, I think is pretty good. So I don't know how you feel about it, Rob, but I don't feel like the Seahawks, got away with one or that the Cardinals deserve to win. What do you think?
Well, I think the one unit on that field on Sunday deserved to win the game, and that was the Seahawks defense. And I have a heart, Arizona dominated time of possession and they had the game within their grasp. And I think that if you were to sort of ask the question, who should have won the game, then clearly it should have been Arizona. I mean, the bizarre decision, I felt it was bizarre. I understand why Bruce Arians went for the 4th and 1 when they were deep in Seahawks territory, because I think he felt like if they could score a touchdown there, then they would win the game. That's probably true. Yeah, it was one of those games. It's also about knowing what situation you are in. This was going to be a lower scoring game. You have the opportunity at points, keep the scoreboard ticking over, put the pressure on the Seahawks, make them feel like they've got to chase the game. And if they score that field goal, I think it would have been 6-0 at the time. That could have been that would have been a winning score because the Seahawks only scored 3 points on a blocked punt. So I think that they blew opportunities. Obviously, they had the block kick. They had the block punt. They surrendered good chances to win the game to the Seahawks, but then the Seahawks also played a contribution to that. I mean, the block punt by Tanner McAvoy, it's not a blown coverage where he happens to get free. I mean, he manhandles his guy and works his way to the kicker and blocks the punt. The block kick from Bobby Wagner is one of the most athletic plays you will see all season. The missed field goal, I think that, if I look at the 2 missed field goals, Stephen Hauschka's is the more worrisome for me because, the Catanzaro's, he's got Wagner right in front of him. He's already had one blocked. He probably has in the back of the mind that Wagner's going to jump the center again. And he's got Richard Sherman rushing from the left-hand side. So there was a lot there impacting the kicker, whereas Hauschka had a pretty clean snap, clean kick, wasn't under too much pressure and hooked it. So I think that really one unit deserved to win that game. and that was the Seahawks defense. And I think that they deserve more credit than they got. And we're talking here as Seahawks fans. I'm sure if we had an Arizona Cardinals representative on here, they would maybe offer a counterpoint to that. But I think that one unit from that whole game really truly deserved to take the win, and that was a legendary Seahawks performance on defense. And I think it was a great answer as well to the week before, because they had that horrible third quarter against Atlanta where there was 2 blown coverages led to touchdowns, another third drive that went all the way deep into territory and led to a Mohamed Sanu touchdown. They've answered that. They've shown that they can bounce back from that, and I think it's very encouraging. And if they get anywhere near that level of performance consistently between now and the end of the season, then the Seahawks are going to take some real stopping in the NFC.
Yeah, speaking of the Seahawks defense, despite the fact that they have a pair of defensive ends that are on pace for 12-plus sacks, Frank Clark is on pace for 12. Cliff Averill is on pace for over 16. He's got 6.5 in 6 games. And Michael Bennett just 3 right now, but obviously having another good season. I think that they have perhaps the best 3-time, as far as a trio goes. It's hard to argue against Averill, Clark, and Bennett right now. That being said, they've had injuries to Garrison Smith, who went on IR. Jordan Hill went on IR and was released. And now today, placing Quentin Jefferson on IR, another one of their rookies that they're not going to be with this season. And they had to sign Tony McDaniel a week before the season in order to get some depth there at defensive tackle. So they've got him, and they've got Atiba Rubin, and they've got Jaron Reed, who's already been dealing with some injuries this season. So at some point, you have to ask yourself if there's going to be a question of depth at the defensive line, and maybe even interior, and that they're moving Michael Bennett around a lot, of course, which is another reason that he doesn't post huge sack numbers. But we saw something similar in the 2014 NFL playoffs when the Seahawks were going to the Super Bowl to face off against the Patriots, and again, defensive tackles were falling down like flies, and then Cliff Averill getting hurt in that game and having to go out, and that made a significant difference in the Super Bowl final score. Was the loss of Cliff Averill, who was just having a dominating performance and pressuring Tom Brady, who couldn't get anything done in the first half, and then in the second half was able to turn it around. And we've seen Averill this season really have the best season of his career, and is just a dominating defensive end. We want to make sure that these guys stay healthy, because it does seem like there isn't a ton of depth right now. So looking around, the Seahawks place Jefferson on IR and pick up Milicia Goodman, Maliciah. If you're in the comments and you know how to say that, please tell me. A 4th-round pick by the Atlanta Falcons out of Clemson in 2013. He has started 11 games, no sacks, 2 forced fumbles. Rob, do you have any thoughts on Goodman? Do you know of him? Do you remember him from that draft? And what are your thoughts on the Seahawks' depth right now on the defensive line?
Yeah, I do remember covering him in the draft. I'm just looking sort of through some notes that I made from the combine when he was there in 2013, and he had, I think he was 36, and I've noted here 36.5-inch arms, which is incredible length. He had 7 sacks in his final year at Clemson. A school that is known for creating productive defensive lines. He had a lot of tackles for a loss. I read that. It was multiple. Over several consistent years, he sort of had some production at Clemson. So I can't say that I've watched him at the next level to say what his issues have been. I know that he's been at Atlanta for 3 years and didn't really do anything. But he's the type of player that the Seahawks like. I think that they were quite determined to add another defensive lineman in the offseason, which is. From one or two things that I heard, they were looking for a guy who could play edge or inside, and that player typically is around 6'4", 6'5", if not taller, is around 275, 280 pounds, and that is Milicia Goodman. That is his general size. So although it's not a like for like, I think Quentin Jefferson in college at least was more of an interior guy, but he kind of had the mobility and the freedom to move inside out. I think that Milicia Goodman is definitely more of an inside out guy, and that's fine because they've got Saliga back now, they've got Jaron Reed, they've got Tony McDaniel. they have got guys who can, Ruben, of course, they've got guys who can kind of plug up the middle on early downs. This is really about finding somebody who can offer a bit of a pass rush there as well. And I just wonder if, as time moves on, maybe whether if this one doesn't work out, maybe they go back and have another look at Jordan Hill, depending on how healthy he is, because that's the type of role they're trying to fill here. They want maybe someone who can, in nickel, can move inside and rush the passer. That seems to be the kind of role they earmarked for Quinton Jefferson and Jordan Hill. Neither of them available now, so they're looking for that type of player. So I think that's what they're looking to add, and maybe Jordan Hill down the line could be an option to return to Seattle. He's had an injury settlement and a payment, so he's a free agent. I think he worked out for a team recently this week, so maybe he is getting back to some kind of football shape. So that's someone that they could also look at down the line.
I mentioned also the Saints coming up this week, and their three receivers, Michael Thomas, Brandon Cooks, and Willie Snead. Willie Snead, a really interesting guy, coming on the scene last year as an undrafted free agent. Let me look up something here really quick. But Willie Snead has been one of Drew Brees' most productive targets, I would say, ever. Obviously it's only been a season and a half. But for him to come on and have that much chemistry with Brees immediately, especially as an undrafted free agent out of Ball State, Snead immediately became like the best player out of Ball State almost ever. There's only about, I would say, 2 or 3 dozen of them. But the only one that's ever gone to a Pro Bowl, defensive back Blaine Bishop, from the 1993 draft, and running back Timmy Brown from the 1959 draft. But Snead has been highly productive coming out of Ball State. I don't know if he was on your radar or anyone's radar, but the Saints seem to have a way, like the Seahawks do, with identifying and finding some of these undrafted free agents and turning them into something. Snead's catching an unbelievable 77.8% of catches, of targets this year. He's got 28 catches for 383 yards, 13.7 yards per catch. I mean, these are pretty similar to Doug Baldwin's type numbers. In terms of targets and catch percentage and yards per catch. It's a very rare thing to have that combination. So Snead's working out really well. 5'11", 195 pounds. But then Brandon Cooks was their first round pick last year, and he's a very speedy, fast guy. And then Michael Thomas was their second round pick this year. I thought that was kind of a questionable pick for a team with the worst defense of all time to be drafting another receiver, but Michael Thomas has 36 catches for 437 yards. He's on pace for, well over 1,000 yards, about 1,100 yards, and, 75 catches, something, 80 catches, something in that line. So pretty productive going to be for him. When you look at the Richard Sherman, Jeremy Lane, and Deshaun Shedd, who do you see sort of being the best matchups for those three guys going up against these three receivers? And is there a receiver that on the Saints that scares you more than the other two based on the type of receivers that give Seattle troubles?
I mean, of those three in particular, the one that would worry me the most is Michael Thomas. I really liked him at Ohio State. I think that he wrote about him a lot last year. I never really thought the Seahawks were going to be in the market for another receiver like that. But I think that he was tremendous value in the second round. I mean, I know that the Saints have a terrible defense, but I think the value of where he went in the draft was insane. And I just, when he was in college, he really combined size. So he's 6'3", 210 pounds, but he's got speed and fluidity. So he can be a guy who beats you over the top. He can get open across the middle. He has got the potential, I think, to be very similar to AJ Green. Another guy of kind of wiry frame, very similar in size, very sudden, great athlete, despite the fact that they're quite tall, and plus 200 pounds. So I genuinely think that is his ceiling, and he's got the perfect team, really, because, if the Seahawks are good at producing cornerbacks and defensive backs and coaching them up, one thing Sean Payton's been able to do is get receivers to be productive in his system. And they work through guys, whether they're drafted in round 1 like Brandon Cooks, or whether they're undrafted free agents, Marquise Colston, players like that, later round picks. Snead, as you mentioned there. They seem to find these guys and then coach them up and then make them productive. And part of that is the scheme and the offense, and part of that is Drew Brees, but they do seem to do a very good job of that. I mean, that is probably the only thing the Saints have done well over the years. I mean, their cap management's appalling. Their defense is historically bad. But they do know how to train receivers. Now, for me, I would put Richard Sherman on Michael Thomas as often as possible. I don't think that I would sort of have him covering him all the time like he did with Brandon Marshall. I think that you have to play your way. I don't think you let New Orleans dictate you in this matchup, because that you're going to go in there probably as the favorite. So if you were talking about just pure matchups, though, I would want Sherman mainly on Thomas. I would be quite happy letting Jeremy Lane try and cover Brandon Cooks and sort of doing that. If Cooks works in the slot, or if he splits outside, I think that Lane against Cooks would be a very interesting match. And Deshaun Shedd's done such a good job, and I would have no problem with him covering Thomas or anybody for that matter. I mean, Deshaun Shedd has been one of the revelations of the season so far. And a great job by him and the Seahawks to get him into a position where he just looks fantastic. So, they are talented. There's no doubt. Drew Brees is still a very good quarterback, but I'm not particularly concerned. I say that in anticipation that they could all have huge games, but I'm not looking at this matchup and thinking, wow, there's a lot to necessarily fear there. I think the Seahawks have just got to be physical. They've got to be tough, and they've got to put some points on the board and move the ball on offense. If they can do that, they've got a great chance of winning this game.
Yeah, I think that, and that'll be a question all week, is that people will see the performance on offense against the Cardinals. They'll think about the 5 quarters. They'll think about, Russell Wilson's lack of mobility in terms of the rush game this year, and how that's taking away a threat for the defenses to key in on and all these kind of same things that people talk about literally every single week, trying to convince themselves and talk themselves into preparing for a Seahawks loss. But get down to brass tacks. The New Orleans Saints, while I picked them to win the NFC South, because I think that their offense is still spectacular, and I think Drew Brees is still arguably the best quarterback in the NFL. He sort of gets lost a little bit as everyone I think at this point pegs him like always at like number 2 or 3, or maybe like 3 or 4. Like everyone's so locked in on Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers that they sort of forget that Drew Brees is arguably the best quarterback of the last 10 years and of his generation, and 37 years old, still at it, and perhaps playing the best football of his entire career right now. So for that reason, I think that, the Saints are a good team, but when you're going up against a team that is 32nd in points allowed and, has a terrible pass defense and a terrible rush defense that has given up 11 rushing touchdowns in 6 games, the Seahawks are a much better overall team. Count on defense. The Seahawks have never had a problem with the Saints, really, other than their playoff game a couple years ago. That was sort of a contest for, most of the way. Have never really had that big of a problem because they match up so well, especially because they know that their defense, they really have problems against, teams like the Cardinals and maybe like the Rams, who have Aaron Donald. But the Saints don't have anybody. Sheldon Rankins is on IR. We liked him a lot here on 3000 NFL Mock Draft as a guy that was the most explosive player in the draft. And if he had been there, maybe he would be there, Geno Atkins or Aaron Donald. But right now he's not there. A terrible defense that I think that the Seahawks will be able to do enough to exploit and win. But that being said, I want to, make sure that if anyone's here for the first time, because I've posted it on fieldgoals.com, that that we can get, maybe give them a taste of all of the things that we can do, and also sort of answer, get everyone involved. So Kenny Sloth, is asking a relevant question right now, which is, what kind of a ceiling, Rob, do you envision for Jermaine Afidi and other members of the offensive line? And before the podcast, we talked about Jermaine Afidi's tweet today about where he called out Pro Football Focus, calling them trash, and saying that they were especially a dumpster fire today for calling Afidi, Sowell, and Gary Gilliam 3 of the worst players in the entire NFL this week, 3 of the worst 10 in the NFL this week based on their game against the Cardinals. We talk about Afidi as a guy who is a really good rookie, and obviously missed some time, made his debut a few weeks ago, and in the preseason and training camp was mauling people and really looking like a good player. I don't have the scout acumen to say whether or not to really say what kind of a season he's having. I wanted to use the word grade, but we're going to sort of talk about maybe PFF's grades and what's so wrong about them. But what kind of ceiling do you envision for Jermaine Ifedi? We've talked about it on the podcast before, but for those who haven't listened before, Rob, what kind of ceiling do you envision for Ifedi, and how do you think that he is doing so far in his first few games? And I'm sure you could also give your thoughts on whether or not you agree with his assessment of PFF.
Okay, well, I'll start with Kenny's question. I think that the kind of ceiling he has is to be a player of similar quality to Kalichi Osemele, who was the guard who was at Baltimore until this year, and then was a big free agent signing by the Oakland Raiders. I mean, he has an almost identical physical profile. His mentality, just watching him in preseason and the attitude that he's brought is very similar. So I think that it's entirely possible that over time he could become that type of player. Osemele didn't walk into the league and immediately become one of the best guards in the NFL. It took a little bit of time, but I think that will be the case with Ifedi, but I do think that he will get there, and I think it will prove to be a very wise addition by the Seahawks over time. Can we expect improvement during the season? Yes. I think certainly the interior of the offensive line will gradually get better. I think that they need time together. Consistency and familiarity is a huge thing with the offensive line, and while there was a lot of hope and promise that this line could be explosive because of the interior guys and the way they played in preseason, it's also worth noting that this is Mark Glowinski's first year as a starter. It's Justin Britt's first year as a center, and it's Jermaine Ifedi's first year full stop. He's a rookie, and Ifedi didn't play the first, 3 or 4 games because of injury. So first 3 games he missed, wasn't it? So, this is going to take a little time to get that chemistry going. I think it's unfortunate that Bradley Sowell has got injured because although he struggled mightily against Chandler Jones, it's Chandler Jones. I mean, people are reacting to this like he got beat by Darryl Tapp. It's Chandler Jones. He's one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. His production shows that. Marcus Golden was a player that I loved in the draft, and he has, I think, 6.5 sacks already this year. He's really developing into a really good player, and they have got Calais Campbell in the middle. So this was a really strong defense that they play. So I'm not surprised that the offensive line struggled somewhat. Plus the fact that Russell Wilson's mobility is poor at the moment. He can't move because of the knee and the ankle injury. So I think there was a bit of an overreaction to the O-line. I do think that it's worrisome that they're going to have to probably play George Fant or Reese Odiambo. I think it's probably more likely to be Fant at left tackle. And certainly not Jamarcus Webb. They don't seem to be too keen on that idea. So, it's concerning that such a raw player like Fant is going to be playing left tackle. But I keep coming back to stuff like this. In 2013, they had Paul McQuiston playing 8 games at left tackle, and they managed that situation. He wasn't great every game. He had some struggles, but he was pretty good. Yes, Russell Wilson was 100% in that year and had his full mobility, and it remains to be seen whether they can be as effective with someone like George Fant at tackle with Wilson hobbled like he is. But this team consistently manages situations like this very well. So, if they don't make a big trade, and maybe we can talk about the Joe Thomas, Joe Staley talk in a little while, but if they don't make a trade, I think that they will find a way to manage this. Quickly on to PFF. My big issue with Pro Football Focus is that anybody can offer an opinion. So I could write a piece, or you could write a piece, Kenny, and say, in my opinion, Jermaine Ifedi was poor against Arizona. And I wouldn't have an issue with that. That's your opinion. Maybe you sat down and watched every snap that he played. That would be not an unfair thing to say about his performance. What PFF do, which is the thing that I have an issue with, is they try to legitimize their opinion. They try to place their opinion on a plateau by giving it a grade, and they masquerade themselves as almost some kind of an official, major authority on this, that because Jermaine Ifedi's only got a 65.4 or however they grade it, that's an absolute truth, that it's watertight, that there's some kind of science to this, that they've kind of fed the numbers through the system and the computer churned out this number. and it's completely accurate, when actually what it is one guy sat at home watching the TV copy, making an assessment like everybody else. And it's that sort of authoritative, we are not wrong, this is how it is, that really bothers me. And it should bother the players as well, because if you're a guy, and it's like Rob Staten says that Jermaine Ifedi played poorly, that's one thing. PFF say that this guy was the third worst player in the week, and here's the grade to prove it. You're giving something as proof, which is just an opinion. You're using the grade as proof. The grade is not proof. That is just someone's opinion. And it churns out the most bizarre things. Like, if people remember, last year, Aaron Rodgers had a 5-touchdown, 0-interception game in a win against Kansas City, who were, an 11-5 team last year? Pretty good defense. And I think they gave Aaron Rodgers a negative grade for that game. They flashed up on the screen on Sunday that Richard Sherman is the 41st best performing cornerback in the NFL. Anybody who has watched Richard Sherman this year knows that there are not 40 cornerbacks playing better than him. I think in 2012, Earl Thomas was down as the 29th best safety in the NFL. I mean, if you want to try and suggest that there's any kind of accuracy to this, you cannot have things like that out there. You just cannot seriously argue that there are 40 guys playing better than Richard Sherman. And the point that you made before we went on air, Kenny, is that how are you judging Sherman? I mean, if Sherman's covering Brandon Marshall and Julio Jones and he gives up a play, are you giving him a negative grade for that? What about if this cornerback doesn't give up a play and he's taking on Tanner McAvoy, a rookie who was playing safety last year for Wisconsin? Does he get a better grade covering that guy than Richard Sherman does covering Julio Jones? Can you honestly expect Richard Sherman to never get beaten by Brandon Marshall? No. I mean, that's, if you expect that to happen, that's so unrealistic. That was a fantastic that was the NFL at its best, Brandon Marshall against Richard Sherman. That you do not get a better matchup than those two going at each other. And both had wins on the day. And no one should have come away from that saying Richard Sherman negative, Brandon Marshall negative. You should have come away going, that was awesome watching those two guys facing off against each other. And I bet PFF gave Richard Sherman a negative grade because he gave up a touchdown. That's the issue I have with this. And it's just the fact that people, every week I see these PFF grades and I just take them away. Just take them away. They are of no use to anybody. And one final point on this. They have started giving out instant grades. So you watch the game, and within minutes on Twitter feeds, you will see, here is how the Seahawks players graded in this game. Are you seriously telling me that one guy or two guys or five guys can sit in an office or a home or wherever, or in the mum's garage or whatever, and watch a game, and then seconds later can give a grade? You can judge every offensive lineman, what their assignments are, who they're facing, taking that into context, taking the context of a down and distance situation, and you're going to give this guy a grade within minutes of the game finishing. And I'll call you a liar, because you just cannot do that. It is impossible to do that. Now, you come back to me in 4 days' time and say you've watched the tape 7 times, and I'll consider your grade and I'll read what you've got to say. Do not give me instant grades moments after a game's finished, because you can't do that.
But even, if isn't there to some degree, like, if you asked Pete Carroll after a game, and Pete Carroll knows these guys inside and out, he's seen them in practice, he knows their weaknesses and their strengths is better than anybody, and their specific game position coaches especially. And they're sitting there on the sidelines. They're calling the plays. They know what the guys are supposed to do on every single play. And they might see something and say, like, oh, man, Ifedi, man, you missed that play. We know that you were supposed to do this and that. But even if you said that, if you went to Pete Carroll after the game, he might go, someone might say, what did you think of Jermaine Ifedi tonight? And he would say, he had a couple misses. I thought he had some good plays. But, we're really going to have to go back and look at the tape and figure out what, and reevaluate. So even Pete Carroll and most, good coaches would say you can't do that. You cannot grade, especially to just be like, well, Pete, what was Jermaine Ifedi's grade tonight? Oh, it was 86. It was 54. I mean, that was obvious. I mean, it's so ridiculous. And, without seeing the whole field, like all 22, obviously coming out days later, without having a guy like we have here at Field Goals this season, Casey Castle deciding to do his own grades. And he, it's amazing to me that he's able to put in enough work to say, I'm going to watch the entire game and just watch Bradley Sowell, or I'm just going to watch Jermaine Afidi. And of course, that's the only way that you could do it would be, to look at every single play on that one player and be like, this is what he did. Oh, this is what he did. This is what he did. You have 22 guys on the field at every given time. How do you evaluate 22 guys without watching the tape 22 times? And that is absolutely not what they're doing. Even if you had 3 guys watching the tape, which I think is what they say they do sometimes, great. Are they watching it 7 times? Where else is this all coming from? Even if you could, somehow watch 2 guys on the same play and be like, and be able to simultaneously, like, I try to the simple things that I try to do, which is like, sometimes I'll interview someone and I'll record it on a recorder, and then I have to go back and transcribe the interview. And if I talk to that person for 30 minutes, the interview is going to take me 2.5 hours to transcribe because you're constantly going back and re-listening and stopping. So to be able to watch a game live with the NBC broadcast and say like, this is the guy's grade, it's so stupid. And like, it is. I think that while Chris Collinsworth, the majority investor in PFF, and thinks that it is a good idea to feature prominently PFF on NBC, I do see the logic behind that. And I wrote today that, yeah, sure, I would do the same thing. But the more you think about it, the more I start to think that the more attention that PFF gets, as soon as it's under a microscope, because for the last couple of years, people would just throw out like, "Oh, you're a football fan? Oh, yeah, no, I like Antonio Bryan or whatever," and they say, "Oh yeah, he's PFF's #1 rated wide receiver," and you're like, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'd love that." So that's good, and that's all you could hear. The more that this is under a microscope, the more people are going to realize how stupid it is and how much the grades. I would applaud them for tracking plays and someone had this many pressures and QB hits and all that kind of stuff. I like that kind of stuff. But the more that you put the grades under a microscope, the more attention that they get by being on NBC. When someone says that this is the 41st, because we hear things like the Aaron Rodgers thing because we're obsessed with football and we dive into it every single day. But the vast majority of football fans are getting out just the stuff like ESPN Sports Center. When you start to put the PFF up on the NBC and see 41st ranked Richard Sherman or whatever, as soon as that's your player, as soon as it's the guy that's on your favorite team, if next week the Arizona Cardinals are up there, because Cardinals fans could have seen that and said, I knew it. If next week it's Patrick Peterson as the 41st or 42nd ranked cornerback, then you're going to be the one saying, what the hell is wrong with these grades? And every single time that happens to a team, every time you talk about the grades or whatever, it's going to keep coming back around. And, unless they can come up with a way to justify these grades reasonably, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see it tumble down at some point.
Well, I hope so.
For being ridiculed due to, once you start to remove the curtain from whatever is happening, as more and more people start to realize that there is no science behind this and no logic behind this.
Can I just make one example here? Yeah. I'm a guy who's never played the game, never worked professionally within the sport. I watch a game. I will happily give an opinion, whether it's on this podcast or on the blog. I don't claim I don't claim to be an authority on it. I just offer an opinion out there and people can take it or leave it. It's on the blog if they want it. That is pretty much what the Pro Football Focus guys are doing. These are not ex-professionals. These are not ex-players or scouts or coaches. For the most part, I believe they are just people like me and you. I may be mistaken on that, but I believe that is the case. Now, the Seahawks blown coverage, the first one against Atlanta, which led to the Richard Sherman sideline rant, it was such a confusing thing to work out why that had happened, why he was so upset, how they allowed Julio Jones to be so wide open. Whose fault was it? Was it Kelsey McRae? Was it Richard Sherman? And I think sort of 2 or 3 days after the game, No one really had any better idea what the problem was there. And then Tony Dungy appeared on ESPN 710 in Seattle, and they asked him what the issue was. And Tony Dungy had actually sat down and watched this play, I believe, with the All-22. The way he was talking, it sounded like an alter. And he just broke this down beautifully and in such detail, and it just became clear. And it made me realize, wow, the way that he's just described that play and the clarity that you have with it now. And even then, he was sort of leaving it open and saying, I think this is what happened there. I think this is what was supposed to happen. I think this is the reason why Julio Jones was open. I think this is what Atlanta were thinking. He didn't say, this is definitely what happened. This is definitely what they were thinking. And I would give this guy an 88.6 for the way that he dealt with that situation. He was leaving it open, and that's Tony Dungy. And I just, when I hear people speaking authoritatively about this guy deserves a grade, I cannot take it seriously. And I wish that we could just rein it back a little bit. Take this for what it is. Judge plays differently. Judge play, like you say, this guy had 3 quarterback hurries. What's wrong with just saying that? He played well because he did this. He played poorly, and this is why. Here's an example. Here's a GIF. Here's a video clip on why this guy struggled. Here's an example of why he struggled. That's fine. These grades make it seem like it is a scientific process, and it's not.
Yeah, it's and I think that it pretty soon, I don't know. We'll see what happens, but the more they try and push these grades, and the more they try and keep them like sort of secretive, and there's nothing proprietary about watching a game film and giving your opinion on it, but going out and giving your opinion on it and not saying that it's in your opinion definitely is a bit sort of, as you were saying, dangerous and irresponsible. I want to talk briefly about some college football because if you're not tuning into 3000 NFL mock draft, it's something that I think it's something worth to see sort of the next wave of college players, and some of the ones that we like a lot and Rob likes a lot. And what better time to do that than with Leonard Fournette, because LSU plays Ole Miss last weekend. Ole Miss was ranked 23rd. LSU having just been ranked 25th with 2 losses this season, but firing Les Miles. And here comes Leonard Fournette, who obviously last year had set the world on fire, and I think this year maybe got underrated a little bit and forgotten a little bit. But he has 16 carries for 284 yards and 3 touchdowns against pretty good up until now Ole Miss team. 17.8 yards per carry on 16 carries. I mean, it's something that I don't know. You rarely see numbers like that, a long of 78. What did you think of Leonard Fournette's game this week? And, with the Cleveland Browns, Football Outsiders has them right now at 55% to get the number 1 pick. They're the only team that hasn't won a game yet. They're down to their 6th string quarterback or something. What do you think of the Cleveland Browns and Leonard Fournette perhaps becoming a match next year?
Oh, well, I think it's a perfect match. I know that very few people would agree with that, and even Cleveland fans, non-Cleveland fans would say, "What the hell are you thinking? Running back first overall." Well, go and watch this guy. Go and watch the way that he played against Ole Miss. I saw a number that someone posted on Twitter. I might be able to find it out, but the fastest player in college football last year was Will Fuller, and the person who sort of tweeted this suggests Texans rookie wide receiver Will Fuller's top speed this year so far is 21.6 miles per hour. They put these little trackers on the players these days, and if anybody watches NFL Red Zone on a Sunday, I think in between the early game and the second spate of games starting, they kind of show who are the fastest players in the 1 o'clock kickoffs, and Will Fuller is the fastest one so far, 21.6 miles an hour. Leonard Fournette's top speed against Ole Miss was 22.9 miles per hour. He's 235 pounds. Will Fuller's probably 190 pounds when he's wet through. He's a special player. He is just special. And if you are trying to build something in Cleveland over the next 2 or 3 years, instead of trying to find this, glorious quick fix, then I would ask yourself, what is more likely to be the next step for you? Is it just to take a potentially generational player, whether that's Leonard Fournette or Myles Garrett? I would have no issue with them taking Myles Garrett at Texas A&M either. Would you rather have a player that is legitimately the first or second best player in the draft? Or would you rather put all of your eggs in the Deshaun Kaiser basket? This is a guy who he looks the part, physically. He speaks with a great maturity. He speaks like a franchise quarterback, but the performances just aren't there. You would be taking a huge gamble on him working out. If it pays off, then great, you get a franchise quarterback, but the risk is very high there. I'm not even sure that Kaiser is going to declare for this draft. For me, he screams as somebody who needs another year in college football. He has minimal starts. He could do with another year at Notre Dame. He might not even declare. Deshaun Watson's not having the greatest year. You might believe in him and believe that he can be the guy for you. That might happen. But I'm putting my faith in Leonard Fournette, and I'm looking at the free agent market, and I'm seeing guys like Jimmy Garoppolo who could be a free agent. Mike Glennon could be a free agent. You might be able to even trade for someone like Tony Romo as a stopgap. I'm looking at those guys and I'm saying, okay, just give me one of those guys for a year. Give me one of those guys for a couple of years. We'll spend a bit of money to bring a Mike Glennon in and see if he can make it work. But I'm having Leonard Fournette run the ball for him. I'm having Leonard Fournette run behind Joe Thomas for the next couple of years. And I'm going to build our identity around that guy. We're going to play great defense. We're going to run the ball with him. And I would have no issue with that whatsoever, because this is not a great year for quarterbacks. It's not a great year for quarterbacks. It's not a great year for offensive linemen. Leonard Fournette is the real deal. And what's more, he's not just a physically brilliant, amazing, stunning player. He can be the face of a franchise. He is incredibly mature. He has taken the lead on so many political issues. The flooding that they had in the state of Louisiana. I think he took control of that and really helped that situation and led the team in that regard. He's an incredible guy, not to mention a great football player. And I have absolutely no doubt that he's going to be a special, special player. And, when a player like that comes along, don't overthink this. Just take the guy and feel really good about it. And, Myles Garrett's very similar. Leonard Fournette and Myles Garrett, both incredible players. I don't think you'd go wrong with either of those guys.
Were there any other performances this week by some of your favorite players that sort of reinforced why they're going to be top 5 picks? I know that Jonathan Allen was a guy that you mentioned to me before the show today. Obviously, Alabama's got a ton of players. So were there any other guys that sort of stood out to you that as soon as they enter the NFL are sort of going to be the next guys that we're talking about on a level of an Aaron Donald or a JJ Watt or one of these guys that it's like week in, week out, this is going to be one of the guys that is constantly being talked about because, the league obviously needs a few more superstars right now, what with sort of the season and the last couple of years that they've had.
Well, I think it was a very impressive weekend by generally all of the Alabama stars on the defense. Jonathan Allen had this, and he was taking on a freshman offensive lineman, it has to be said, but he great swim move to get away from him. The running back who was into block actually went to sort of cut him down and went for his legs. And Jonathan Allen just leaped over the guy like Superman and made the sack. I mean, if you have not seen this already, just type in Jonathan Allen into your search bar on Twitter. You will see some of the Bleacher Report actually did a really amazing GIF on this sack, which I posted on the blog over the weekend. So you could go and check it out on there. I mean, it is one of the best GIFs you will ever see of Jonathan Allen making this sack. It is one of the best sacks you will genuinely ever see. And he was so impressive at the weekend, and he just looks really, really strong. I think he's up to about 6 or 7 sacks already. People have compared him to Ndamukong Suh. I think he's a little bit different to Suh. I think Suh was really just a defensive tackle, could play a bit of end, but a fantastic interior rusher. I think that Jonathan Allen's more of an inside-out type of guy. Play a bit of end, play inside. But he is really good. Tim Williams. I mean, Tim Williams is so underrated. I cannot believe that people are not putting him in the top 10. Yeah, he's got some character problems that teams are going to have to look at, but he seems like a decent guy, and I would just to listen to him. He doesn't sound like a trouble causer, and obviously sounding like one and being one is an issue, and you would have to look into his background. But to me, he is somebody that is just so incredibly talented. So explosive off the edge. The type of player that the league is constantly looking for. And I think after Myles Garrett, he has to be the second best edge rusher in this class. Marlon Humphrey had a spectacular interception in the game against Texas A&M, and he just looks incredible. Top 10 cornerback, just superb player. Reuben Foster is a phenomenal linebacker. The way that he shoots gaps, incredibly solid hitter. I think he can be a really effective blitzer. Reuben Foster in his own right is a top 10 pick. We may well see 4 guys from Alabama go in the top 10 as well. I mean, that is very, very possible with Williams, with Allen, with Foster, and with Jonathan Allen. There's a very real prospect to that. And Ryan Anderson as well. He's not a great athlete, and that may limit his stock a little bit. But Ryan Anderson's playing really, really well and just sort of complements everybody else on that team. And the other player that really sort of impressed me the weekend again was Marquise Haynes. He's a player that we talked about in the past. Ole Miss linebacker, edge rusher. He's small, he's undersized, he's not going to be an early round pick. I've seen him in 1 or 2 first round mock drafts, and I don't think he's ever going to go that high. But I think if the Seahawks wanted to add some competition to that Cassius Marsh type role, Mike Morgan type role, that Marquise Haynes is somebody they could really look at. But in terms of the draft, it's looking like a really strong draft at tight end, really strong draft, amazingly strong draft at safety. There's some good cornerbacks in this class, and defensive linemen. They are really the positions of strength in this draft next year.
Yeah, and I'm sure that if the Alabama does, they're obviously going to send a lot of guys to the NFL, and the amount that go to the top 10 or the first round, I'm sure they've got the next in line to just replace them and keep shuffling them through, because Alabama has definitely, in a way, become the minor league system for the NFL. If you want to get your NFL training, go to Alabama. If you are one of the top 50 players in the nation, if Alabama is anywhere in your purview, and if you're on their radar, it seems to be the place that you're going to go. And there's a lot of guys that we could talk about in terms of their first 2 to 3 years right now in the NFL from Alabama. Obviously, Jaron Reed of the Seahawks being one of them as a transfer who had gone to Alabama for to finish up his college career, and it serves them pretty well. But in terms of, first of all, I want to remind everyone that this weekend, if you're watching college football, if you're a college football fan, especially in the state of Washington, I think 2 really important games this weekend being Washington going to Utah. So that's number 4 Washington traveling to number 17 Utah. It could be Washington's, other than the Apple Cup, just because I think the background of that game, it's going to be Washington's biggest, toughest contest right now is going to Utah. We were just talking about before the show, we were talking about Joe Williams, a running back at Utah who retired this season for 4 games, only to come back, and he rushed for 332 yards last week against UCLA, following up 179 yards the week before against Oregon State. So he's rushed for over 500 yards in his last 2 games. So obviously that's the one that Washington is going to have to key in on. But if they can, and if they can obviously get out of here right now, they're in position to play for the national championship in the playoffs if they can get through Washington State and then the Pac-12 championship at Washington State. Another game that to watch for this weekend as they take on Arizona State, because Washington State is just 1 spot out of being in the AP top 25. If Wazoo wins, there's pretty much no way that they won't be in the top 25. So that'll be interesting to watch too, because a few weeks down the line, we're going to be talking about perhaps the most significant Apple Cup in history if Washington is still undefeated, and if Wazoo comes in there with an undefeated conference record, which is what they have right now, the only 2 teams in the Pac-12 that haven't lost. Washington State, it's so unbelievable that they lost in week 1 to Eastern Washington. For them to lose to an FCS team, if you take that away, then the only loss that they have is a 3-point loss to Boise State, who is also undefeated. So that's how close they are. And if you took away that Eastern game, you could easily say that Wazoo is a top 15 team. If they aren't the same team that lost to Eastern, if you could say that they aren't that team, like that was a bad week, because everyone has a bad week. If they aren't that team, then Wazoo is a top 15 team in their hearts, and that's the sort of contest that UW will get in the Apple Cup. Rob, do you have any more thoughts as UW has moved into the top 4 and as Wazoo is knocking on the door of the top 25?
Well, I think that it is a good test for Washington. I think that they maybe had their little scare against Arizona, a game that they should have won comfortably and needed overtime. And I think that maybe acted as a bit of a wake-up call for them. That was a good thing to happen for them. And they are better than Utah. Utah are a tough team, well coached, well drilled. But I think that Washington is incredibly talented this year. The defense is just playing incredible. They've got explosive players on offense. They've got a quarterback who's playing incredibly well. They do remind me a lot of the Boise State teams under Coach Peterson. They look similar, and I just cannot see anything but this Washington momentum continuing. Really, really like what they've built there, but at the same time, you do just wonder. I mean, who expected Ohio State to lose to Penn State at the weekend? Penn State have been awful for a while now. Their coach has been on the hot seat for a long time, and yet they go and beat Ohio State. So you can never take anything for granted. But I would still favor Washington in this game against Utah. As for Washington State, they've collected some impressive wins. The wins against teams like UCLA, Arizona State, that they're putting things together. It's kind of similar to last year. They lost to Portland State, was it last year? And I remember we talked often about, where would they be if they hadn't lost to Portland State? Would they be higher up the rankings? And it's very, very similar this year. I think that they are well placed to win now, keep winning, take it to the Apple Cup. But there is something about Mike Leach and his team that just when they tend to get to the point when you really start to believe in them, they let you down a little bit. And it was kind of the same way at Texas Tech. I remember when they, if you remember the big Michael Crabtree catch in I think it was 2008 when they beat Texas and Colt McCoy, and they beat them in the last second against all odds with Graham Harrell as the quarterback, and I think at the time they may have been the number 1 or number 2 team in the country. And then they went and played Oklahoma and were destroyed by Sam Bradford and Oklahoma, torn to shreds. So, I hope that this will continue for both teams. I'd love to see a really good Apple Cup. I'm actually going to be at the Washington-Arizona State game in 3 or 4 weeks' time. So I'm looking forward to. I hope they will stay undefeated, so we can go watch an undefeated team and see some exciting football at Husky Stadium. But I'd love to see a really competitive Apple Cup this year, with potentially the winner progressing to the Pac-12 championship game.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Actually, I just today bought a ticket to go see my first Wazoo game of the year, and in a couple years is I'm gonna go to Boulder. I'm gonna see them take on Colorado in a few weeks. It's about a few weeks from now. I'm gonna go ahead and see them take on Colorado as Colorado jumps into the top 25. Should be a great Pac-12 matchup. Obviously, if that'll be one game for Wazoo if they don't lose between now and then, to really show that they are not a joke when they take on, the Huskies. One last college question for you, Rob, that does revolve around the University of Washington again is, the Heisman watch. Lamar Jackson of Louisville, Jake Browning of Washington, Deshaun Watson of Clemson. These 3 might be right up there at the top right now. And you talked about the Huskies' very talented defense and their very talented running backs. When you look at Jake Browning's case for Heisman and you look at Lamar Jackson's case for Heisman, do you think that there's any contest in terms of who is carrying their team at this point? And the same said for Deshaun Watson, who takes on Florida State and Dalvin Cook this week. In terms of the Heisman, do you think that Lamar Jackson is, carrying a team unlike any other player in the nation right now? Of course, I think that you would also like to, throw a hat in the ring for Leonard Fournette as the College Player of the Year. Though in a Heisman race, you sort of have to be in that national championship talk.
Yeah, Fournette's issue is that he's missed time with an injury. They've been very careful with him, and I like that. I like the fact that LSU have protected him, because if he was to get a serious injury this year, then we would all be talking about the whole debate about letting players become NFL pros, as freshmen or sophomores, and that whole debate opening again. So I'm glad the fact that they've managed him properly this year. But I think Fournette's probably the best player in college football on his day, but he's not going to win the Heisman. I think that Lamar Jackson has pretty much got this in the bag, unless there is a huge collapse by Louisville on the back end of their schedule. There doesn't seem to be any reason for that to happen. Their toughest game remaining, I think, is Houston, who just lost to SMU and lost to Navy, I think it was recently. So, there's nothing to suggest that Louisville are going to collapse here. And as long as he keeps scoring touchdowns, 24 total touchdowns, the fact that which is similar to Jay Browning, by the way. I think Jay Browning's on 30 and Lamar Jackson's on 34. And the passing yards are not hugely different, but Lamar Jackson has 900 rushing yards and Jay Browning has 69. So, the Jackson is going to win the Heisman without a collapse. If he does collapse, or if he gets injured, or if Louisville's season just suddenly tanks, then Browning's going to be in pole position because he's been convincing. And Washington's schedule is set up for them potentially to go unbeaten or to make a playoff run and win the Pac-12. So he's in the mix, but I do think that Lamar Jackson is the guy who's going to win this, barring a major upset.
I said that was the last college football question, but I do have to ask one more, which is, did you see this Oklahoma-Texas Tech game?
I didn't see it. I obviously heard about it. And
I just got to, I'm just sort of catching up on everything right now, but I have to just say this out loud so that it registers in my brain. I think it'll be fun to say, but in this game that had over 1,200 yards of passing, Baker Mayfield, the quarterback at Oklahoma, 27 of 36, 545 yards, 15.1 yards per attempt, 7 touchdowns. Patrick Mahomes of Texas Tech, 734 passing yards. And even amid all that, Joe Mixon, a running back that's got an NFL future, had 263 rushing yards, and D.D. Westbrook had 202 receiving yards. But I just want to say this, which is these are the drives. It was already 30-24 at the end of the first half, but the last 2 drives of the first half, this is all of the last drives. Touchdown, 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 end of game. Every single drive in the second half, except for the first in which Texas Tech punted, was a touchdown drive by each offense, 66-59. Oklahoma wins one of the most ridiculous games that I've ever heard of. Any thoughts there on Mayfield and Mixon or anything in that game?
Well, I don't enjoy football like that. For me, there's nothing better than watching a great defense, and watching your team be explosive on offense is a wonderful thing. But I wouldn't even really enjoy the Seahawks playing in a game like that. It's just not football. To play defense that poorly on both sides accounts. I've just no interest. I mean, just endless touchdowns. Where's the fun in that? It's almost like a tennis player trying to hold serve. You would expect them to hold serve, and if they don't, it's a surprise. Well, in this game, holding serve equaled scoring a touchdown. I don't think Baker Mayfield is a player with much of an NFL future. He was somebody that people talked about, but I would put him firmly in the Chad Kelly range of someone who's probably going to go in round 4 to 6 and just end up the same way that Kevin Hogan, for example, who was the former Stanford quarterback. I think that Joe Mixon is a very interesting player and a very interesting talent, very exciting to watch, has certainly got a potential to be really good. But for people who aren't aware, he has this he punched a female student in a restaurant or a cafe a couple of years ago. I've written about this on the blog. If you Google Joe Mixon Seahawks draft blog, you will probably find the piece. Now there's a lot of contention around it. It's a highly controversial subject. It's kind of similar to the controversy around Frank Clark, where we're seeing the NFL struggle to sufficiently manage how they approach domestic violence or cases like this. The Josh Brown story recently is another example of that, sadly. So I'm not sure how teams are going to approach Joe Mixon as to whether or not they would even consider drafting him, whether they would satisfy themselves in a way that the Seahawks did with Frank Clark and be willing to take him. Joe Mixon has got the talents going round 1 or 2. Whether or not he goes that early is going to depend on what teams learn about him between now and the combine and then the draft. So a very interesting player to watch on tape, but one with serious flags that would need to be investigated. I have absolutely nothing to say about the defensive talent on Oklahoma. They should be doing better than they are, and they're not. I watched them against Houston and was completely underwhelmed. So a disappointing year for Oklahoma. And Texas Tech, you've got a quarterback who can throw for 700 yards. Give him a defense. Why? Surely you've got it. I mean, they've not had a defense. When's the last time Texas Tech had a defense? Do they even field the defense? Do they just have the offensive guys out there?
Well, yeah, I've had to, I had to endure that question myself when the Cougs hired Mike Leach. And interestingly enough, I think that in like one of his last years or two, they had maybe the best defense in the Big 12. And it was right up there, and they specialized in it. And that was the year that they almost got to the national championship, or at least a top 2 ranking. Been pretty rare, and I think that when we're seeing Wazoo turn around their fortunes now, it's because they're not doing the air raid offense in the same way, and they are running the football. They're a much better running team now than they have ever been under Mike Leach, and it's made them it's helped contribute to being a better and more well-rounded team. So, that type of football, it's definitely makes for interesting box scores, but perhaps not the best football to see. And I think Oklahoma, if anything, despite whoever you're playing, to play that poorly, to allow 700 passing yards. If you're Oklahoma and you're a top 15 team, I do want to wrap up and go to a few NFL topics just to do that sort of wrap up. We want to look at the NFC really quick because the Eagles beat the Vikings. If you look at Football Outsiders DVOA ratings this week, the Eagles jumped from 4 to 1 and took a pretty substantial lead over the Seahawks, who remain in number 2, because they beat the Vikings, who were ranked number 1, and they dropped to number 4. But then when you really look at the NFC, who has 4 of the top 5 teams in DVOA, as well as 6 of the top 8, you start to see that the NFC is much stronger than the AFC. If you didn't realize it, start to open up the old peepers and take a look, because the AFC is pretty stinky, and the only team that may come out of that, hey, have you been paying attention to the football in the last 5 years? Guess what? The Patriots or the Broncos are going to come out of the AFC. And that hasn't changed. And they don't have to, because when you look at the competition, there is none. And then in the NFC, you've got the Eagles, who are now number 1 in DVOA with a number 1 defense, the Seahawks, who are number 2, the Vikings, who are number 4, the Cowboys, who are number 5 without Tony Romo and without Des Bryant for most of the season, the Packers, who are number 8, skip the Falcons, who are number 7. So the NFC is going to be really tough. But also an interesting is that all 3 of those NFC teams and the Broncos are fielding some pretty below average defenses, because in offenses, because in DVOA, the Eagles are 24th, the Seahawks are 20th, the Broncos are 17th, and the Vikings are 23rd. And this could also explain some of the ratings drop. Interesting that with Dak Prescott, the Cowboys are number 1 in offense. And that's been a pretty incredible thing to watch, with Prescott and Elliott. And Cole Beasley really sort of leading the Cowboys to being a formidable 5-1 team. But I still look at Minnesota and I say, with the performance that you got out of Sam Bradford this week, that's the Sam Bradford that I'd come to know. With the performances that we've seen recently in some games by Carson Wentz, it is more similar to that of a rookie quarterback that we would expect. Though I still think that I wasn't too hopeful about Carson Wentz going into the year if he was going to start right away. But now, he is obviously a very good quarterback, especially for his experience level. But I still would have my doubts about that when you talk about, Wentz and Prescott and Sam Bradford when compared to Russell Wilson. So when you look at the right now, Rob, where do you see the Seahawks stacking up? Which teams do you think are going to prove to be less dangerous by the time January comes around than they look so far? And which ones do you think will be providing the biggest tests for Seattle?
Well, I thought the DVOA stuff was very interesting because, you mentioned the top four teams there, Philadelphia, Seattle, Denver, and Minnesota, all great defenses, or at least great defensive performances so far. And none of them with anything to really hang their hat on offense. So Philadelphia, Carson Wentz has been really good at times, kind of average at other times. Seattle's running game is, I think, the 31st running game in the NFL, which is, it's not been that bad since 2010. So it's incredible. And Russell Wilson is hurt. Denver have kind of, they're not running the ball particularly well. Trevor Simeon's done fairly well. But Paxton Lynch had a shocker against Atlanta in his first game. He's clearly not ready just yet. And then Minnesota, they have Sam Bradford and he's done well, but it's Sam Bradford, and their running game has not looked great. And it shows how important in this year of average football, where pretty much everybody is playing average offensive football, apart from Tom Brady, then if you can play great defense, that's going to be the difference maker. And I think ultimately what it will be, this will be another year similar to last year when Denver won it. This is my personal view. New England might win the Super Bowl. Not taking that away from them. Tom Brady might win another Super Bowl. It's possible. But I personally think the team that wins this Super Bowl, the teams that are going to be contesting the Super Bowl, are going to be the teams that play the most consistently good defense. I think that DVOA is showing us how important that is right now. It's why I would be a little bit concerned if I was a Dallas fan, because I think that Dallas's main strength is that they have a terrific run game. That's why they're fifth in DVOA, because their run game, their offense is really good. Dak Prescott's not making bad decisions. He's taking what a defense gives him. Zeke Elliott's running the heck out of the football. They're doing very well on the offensive line, as you'd expect, but their defense isn't great. They've got things to hang their hat on offense, but not on defense. There is no complete team. There is not a complete team in the NFL this year. And the thing that would worry me about Dallas is that while running the ball as well in the playoffs, if you've still got Dak Prescott in there, how is he as a rookie going to take to the playoff environment? Are you going to be able to produce on defense to limit a team? And if you're coming up against an elite defense yourself, are they going to sort of take away your strengths? And are you going to be able to throw a punch back on defense? I'm not sure about that. So I think DVOA very, very interesting this week. And as for sort of the strength of the NFC, I was quite happy with the draw against Arizona, because it kept Seattle kind of in the bracket with Minnesota and Dallas. They're both 5-1. I think the obsessive compulsive disorder part of me, I think everybody's got a little bit of OCD about them, and mine is the annoyance of having to see 4-1-1 instead of just 5-1. But it keeps them in tow there. And when I look across the division, I worked for national radio over the weekend, and the game that they were covering on national radio in the UK was Atlanta against San Diego. So I watched the whole game, and I saw nothing from Atlanta in that game that made me think that they're going to be a legitimate Super Bowl contender. I watched Green Bay against Chicago, was very unimpressed. Arizona are not the team that they were last year. And I just don't feel threatened by Minnesota and Dallas. I just think that if Seattle would play either of those teams at home, they would win. And I think if they played them on the road, they would have a good chance of winning. I think Seattle is the favorite in the NFC. I think if you spoke to most neutrals or people who were not Seahawks fans, they would probably go along with that. I think Seahawks fans are probably more likely to be critical of this situation or more cynical, because they are picking apart, the faults of the team right now. Whereas I think others will look at the overall quality of the roster and the performances and will say, yeah, they look really strong. So I think that the Seahawks would be the favourites right now to get the number one seed in the NFC. But they've got to take care of business. I think this would be a very interesting game against New Orleans, because it's a team they should beat, but it's on the road and it's an early start, 10 o'clock start. So, Goins, let's see if they can handle their business now after a tough game against Arizona. If they can do that, get to 5-1-1. You get Buffalo Monday Night Football. New England's on the horizon. I think that the New England and Green Bay games can be very difficult. They could win the rest. I think the Seahawks are in a very strong position in the NFC. So I'm feeling pretty good about that right now.
Yeah, and the other thing too is as you talked about, sort of where the Tide left Seattle in the NFC standings. Right now, they're still, according to Football Outsiders, right now they're 86% to make the playoffs. I think that it's pretty fair. I wrote something for Sports on Earth that's not out quite yet, but it talks about how standings don't change that much after the first month. Basically, after 6 weeks, pretty much every season since division realignment, after 6 weeks, there is only maybe one or two changes per year from week 7 to the playoff standings, where the division champion was someone different than it was in mid-October. Bill Belichick said that this year in the preseason, which is you don't really know who you are until mid-October, but I would argue that you know exactly who you are by that point. So if right now there shouldn't really be too many surprises unless there's an injury, and we've seen that happen, of course, and that's often a case for why a team may go from first to second or lower. But anyone that's in first place right now stands a really good chance of being in first place by January, or at least getting a wild card berth. Usually it's almost never less than 6 teams that would change, that would not win their division if they're leading right now. And oftentimes it's 7, sometimes it's all 8. But when you look around and you see the Falcons and the Seahawks and the Packers and the Vikings and the Cowboys, there's no reason to think that those won't be the division winners. If it's a team like the Buccaneers, who are tied right now in the loss column, then they're only a half game back. And Philadelphia is only 1 game back, and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, this is what you get. And there's going to be maybe surprises, maybe in wild card. But when you look at the AFC, I talked about the Patriots, who are 95% to make the playoffs right now. And I talked about the Broncos, who are in the hardest race right now in a 2-loss tie. They're 5-2, the Raiders are 5-2, and the Chiefs are 4-2. But the Broncos have a 76% chance, according to Football Outsiders, to make the playoffs, and a 44% chance to win the division. I think 538's numbers might even favor the Chiefs, actually. But for the most part, do you see anyone in the AFC, and do you think that the Oakland Raiders, from what you've seen as a team that has a good offense and a bad defense, is this sort of the year that we might see the Oakland Raiders make it to not just the playoffs, but maybe even a couple rounds deep into the playoffs?
I think that they're going to struggle to go deep into the playoffs this year. And the reason for that is the defense. I can't trust it. It's given up too many points. It looks like a real weakness. Some of the big moves they made, Bruce Irvin, for example, haven't quite worked. They signed Sean Smith, who's been a bit hit and miss. They still have Khalil Mack, but I get the feeling that maybe Oakland is a draft or 2 away from being a really strong contender, and a defensive draft, because I think on offense they're pretty much there. I think that Derek Carr he looks like a guy who may never be Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, Drew Brees, but I think that he's got a really good chance to be Matt Ryan. And the reason why Matt Ryan never won a title in Atlanta is not really anything to do with Matt Ryan, in my opinion. I think it's because the Mike Smith Falcons were not good enough defensively and were a little bit soft. And if Oakland can set up a situation where their defense is really strong and they can run the ball to complement Derek Carr and Amari Cooper, and Michael Crabtree's done a really good job for them, by the way, then they've got a chance to be really strong in the AFC. But it is going to come down to the defense. I think we have seen the greatest example of, despite the fact the NFL has tried to push this as a passing league, that has tried to make the emphasis star quarterbacks. When Green Bay won a championship, it looked as if it was going to go that way in 2010. But things have changed. And I think the Seahawks have played a big part in this. You've got to be good defensively. You have to have a strong defense. You have to be able to play that way if you want to go deep into the championship. So I don't think Oakland's defense is there yet. And it may be that they make some changes, maybe bring in a new coordinator. It hasn't really worked for Ken Norton so far. maybe make some big free agent moves, similar to what they did with Osemele in the offseason. Maybe just focus their energies in the draft on the defense. But I think that they're probably a draft away from being, the peak of their potential. But it's I must admit, it's kind of fun to see them doing well, and it's fun to see a new team who has been crappy for such a long time emerge as a potential playoff contender. And what are they, like 5-2 right now? So they're really well placed to at least get to the playoffs. But I do think that they will eventually come unstuck.
Yeah, I think the defense is very far away, and they've got a couple of Seahawks there with Bruce Irvin and Ken Norton, the defensive coordinator. Though it sounds like he's lost some of his duties there because they were playing that poorly on defense, and they did go out and pay guys like Sean Smith, the cornerback, and Reggie Nelson, the safety, and they drafted guys like Carl Joseph, the safety, who I think has helped their defense and has only been coming on in the last couple of weeks. So they put in definitely the resources and tried. And Khalil Mack, who has been super quiet this season, compared to last season when he was arguably, was starting to make waves as maybe the best defensive player or best pass rusher in the NFL, doesn't have a lot going on in terms of the numbers this season. But yeah, they haven't definitely been doing enough. But my prediction is I just feel like they're going to go up against a team like the Steelers in the playoffs, and someone's going to win the game 52-46. And that's sort of where my thoughts are with the Raiders, and they might put up a nice show at some point in the playoffs, but unless they can here with sort of Carl Joseph, maturing and becoming a safety that's going to set the tone in the secondary, and finding a legit cornerback. I think Sean Smith was a good attempt. DJ Hayden obviously has not worked out to this point. David Amerson is a guy that, these are all decent players in some regard, but they don't have that shutdown cornerback that they really would need to solidify that secondary. And they've got Khalil Mack, but they definitely need more players in terms of defensive tackles and nose tackles, and maybe a real leader in the middle of the linebacking corps, something like that. But not clearly the results are not there. Last question, Rob, is I mentioned before that I have an article coming out about sort of this Amari Cooper, and when I did more research on him, his high school coach said that he drove Cooper to school every single day and for 3 years, and he said that maybe he said 100 words to me. He is so quiet, and he is so what you would expect of a star wide receiver, then maybe it's hurting him in terms of a public persona or profile if you wanted that kind of thing. Obviously there's a lot of attention on Odell Beckham, and there's a lot of attention on some of the other receivers because they're so loud, but you don't get those sort of sports center-y talks and highlight reels and all that kind of. And it seems like partly because of Amari Cooper's game is that it's not about one moment of a catch that's phenomenal, but a collection of things. When you watch him run in the open field, his ability to cut and accelerate and do things so quickly and in a way that don't seem physically possible. It's sort of like he is just a laser beam that can go in any direction at any point, and that's a lot of what he is able to do. So we talked about Alabama, and we've talked about Julio Jones, and Julio Jones, when I watch the Falcons, it's really perhaps the best thing to watch in the NFL. He's so exciting, and he's so hard to defend, and he's so hard to beat, and it doesn't matter who he's going up against. And he's putting up 300 yards in a game, or he can easily go put up 180 on any defense. But do you think that Amari Cooper is better? Do you think that his personality is well suited for the Raiders and sort of the NFL and any team as far as being potentially a superstar, but not one that wants to talk about being a superstar?
Well, yeah, he was obviously very, very good at Alabama, and even in his first year, I think he was a true freshman at Alabama. You could see that he had natural ability as a receiver. He had a really high drop rate in college, and that continued last year. He does drop passes. He's not the most sure-handed player, but neither was Julio Jones. Julio
I
Jones
will
when he
say
was at
this:
Alabama.
he, just to add in, to that, he did have 10 drops on 100 and some targets last season. He's got 1 drop on 40 targets this season. So I don't know if that's a coincidence or if it's something that he's worked on, but potentially the reason that he's on pace for 1,400 yards this year, a big reason. He may have cleaned up those drops, but obviously the proof will be in the full season pudding.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one area that he will have worked on because he had issues with that in college, and it did continue last year. Yeah, as I was saying, Julio Jones had the same issue at Alabama. He would drop past too many passes. So, he was always destined to be really good. It wasn't a surprise at all that he went as early as he did. I think it's a really good combo. They kind of did it the same way that Cincinnati did it with AJ Green and Andy Dalton. They took the receiver early, and then went and got the quarterback later in the draft, and that's kind of what they've done. Second round quarterback, first round receiver. He always had this ability of getting open, and he wasn't the most athletic. He had a good combine, not an amazing combine, but he's just such a naturally gifted player. And yeah, his personality was always very serious. I remember watching interviews of him when he was at Alabama and ahead of that draft, and incredibly serious guy, all about football. You could tell that he'd been coached by Nick Saban. I think that he's probably never going. He's not a flashy player. He's about 6'1" or something like that, and he's not huge. He doesn't have the kind of Julio Jones physique or Calvin Johnson or something that would make him an absolute top superstar. And he doesn't have the personality of someone like Odell Beckham Jr. To make headlines and be in the news all of the time. So for that reason, he's probably always going to fly a bit under the radar. But what the Raiders are going to get from him is, health permitting, 10 to 12 years of consistent production, reliability, a best friend for Derek Carr, somebody that they can rely on, whether it's to make a touchdown, late in a game, or convert a third down to extend a drive. He's always going to be really good for them. So he's been destined for this. It's not a surprise. I've always liked him. I think anybody who appreciates good football will like him. If he's tidying up the drops, even better. But he's just going to be a really, really consistent, no-nonsense football player for years, and the type that every team would just love. Someone who doesn't cause drama, someone that doesn't make headlines, someone that isn't a diva and just produces week in, week out.
Yeah, and you mentioned his draft status, 4th overall last year in the 2015 draft. Obviously, this is 3,000 NFL mock draft. We talked about last year's draft quite a bit, just on our our live show during the actual draft, and then leading into this next year's draft. And we talked a lot about the most recent draft. The last thing is just, because you mentioned his thing, I'm kind of curious, because when you look back at drafts that are, say, 5 or 10 or 20 years old, it's easy to look at the top 10 and think, how did that guy go there? How did that guy go there? Oh man, I can't believe that guy slipped to there, because he's such a game changer. Any thoughts now that we're a year and a half removed from the draft in terms of the top 10, 11? Because you look at it now and you've got Jameis Winston and Marcus Mariota at the top, which I think is probably always going to be defensible because they were good quarterback prospects. But after that, Dante Fowler, Amari Cooper, Brandon Scherf, Leonard Williams, Kevin White, Vic Beasley, Eric Flowers, Todd Gurley, Trey Waynes. Out of those players right then, anyone that immediately stands out to you as, yep, that was a horrible pick, or yep, that guy should have gone higher?
I mean, looking at it, it's, I think that Winston and Mariota have played well. I think that Mariota's kind of hamstrung a little bit by the fact that he's with Tennessee. Their ownership situation, their coaching situation is going to be a hindrance for him and everybody else there until they get that sorted. I think the best thing for that franchise is that they get sold as soon as possible and have some direction and build around Mariota. Winston is who he is. Dante Fowler, hard to judge him because of the injury last year. I think that Leonard Williams has looked pretty good. Kevin White's been a bust so far because of injuries, which is a shame for him. I think Vic Beasley, I saw the Atlanta game. Vic Beasley was superb against San Diego, and he and Joey Bosa just look like two, potential superstars as edge rushers. So good for him. I think that Eric Flowers has done better than some people want to give him credit for. I think that he's in a league that has a dearth of good offensive tackles. I think that he's been okay. Todd Gurley flatters to deceive a little bit because the Rams are a mess offensively and will be until they get the quarterback situation sorted. I'm kind of looking down the list. There isn't really anybody. I mean, Melvin Gordon's starting to produce touchdowns. So, that looked like a bust at the end of last year, but now he's starting to look like a pretty useful player for them. Marcus Peters, obviously, is the one you could focus on. I mean, Marcus Peters went 18th overall and could make a strong case to be the best player who came out of this draft class. I mean, he is just exceptional at cornerback. So I think if you were going to sort of highlight one player who has maybe performed better than expected or performed better than his draft placing, I would probably say him.
Yeah, 13 interceptions for Marcus Peters in less than a season and a half is pretty insane. And cornerback seems to be one of the slowest positions to develop into a useful player at the NFL level. Just ask Trey Waynes, who went ahead of him. Kevin Johnson just being injured this year now, and he's going to go down on IR. Both those guys going against Peters, and but it was pretty interesting. I love looking back at drafts and seeing what we think now compares to what we thought at the time. And what I think now is that it's time to wrap up 3000 NFL mock draft. Thank you to Kenny Sloth for being a guy that contributed in the comments and throwing out some questions. Sorry we didn't get to your second question, but come back next week and we'll try it again. And, go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Check out Rob's latest mock draft for 2017 and see who he's got going to the Seahawks, as well as, the top 10. And then go to fieldgoals.com, follow on Twitter at Rob Staten and at Field Goals and at Kenneth Arthur S. But subscribe on iTunes to 3000 NFL Mock Draft and to Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur for more Seahawks previews and instant recaps of the game. That's it for this week and this draft of the podcast, and we'll come back next week for the following draft.